A widowed coal miner agrees to marry a desperate stranger. Unaware, she holds the secret to finding his long-lost son. Will their journey to reunite a broken family transform their marriage of convenience into something neither of them expected? Blood dripped from Thomas Blackwood's split knuckles onto the dirt road as he staggered home from the Millfield saloon. The pain felt good, real, unlike the hollow emptiness that filled his chest every night. A dog barked in the distance. The moon hung low over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the sleeping mining town. "Got no right looking at me that way," Thomas muttered, remembering the barkeeper's face when he'd refused another whiskey. Everyone in town wore that same expression nowadays. Pity mixed with discomfort, like he was a sick animal they couldn't bring themselves to put down. The cottage appeared ahead, dark and unwelcoming. 3 years empty of laughter. 3 years without Emma's warm smile or William's excited footsteps racing to greet him. Thomas stumbled on the front step, catching himself against the doorframe. Inside, the chill matched the October air. He hadn't bothered lighting a fire in days. He fumbled with the lamp, his coal-stained fingers trembling as the small flame cast eerie shadows across the room. Emma's rocking chair sat empty by the cold hearth. William's wooden horse lay forgotten in the corner, gathering dust. Thomas couldn't bear to move their things, as if doing so would erase the last proof they ever existed. "Should have been me," he whispered, sinking into his chair. The coughing sickness had taken Emma quick, too quick for goodbyes. And William? The boy had been sent to the county orphanage while Thomas worked double shifts, trying to pay off the doctor bills. Then came the fire. The terrible fire that devoured half the building and left nothing but ashes and questions. Thomas pulled a crumpled letter from his pocket, the same one he'd carried for 5 years. "Regret to inform you, presumed among the missing. No remains identified." The words blurred as he stared at them for the 100th time. Some nights he dreamed William had escaped, was living somewhere with a new family, happy and whole. Other nights, the nightmares of smoke and flames jolted him awake, gasping in the darkness. A sharp knock startled him. Thomas glanced at the small clock on the mantel, nearly midnight. Who would come calling at this hour? "Mr. Blackwood? Are you home?" The voice belonged to Reverend Porter, the young minister who'd buried Emma and held the memorial for William. Thomas considered staying silent, pretending to be asleep or gone. Instead, he dragged himself to the door, running a hand through his graying hair. Black as coal when Emma was alive, now streaked with ash at 36. "Reverend," Thomas acknowledged, not opening the door fully. "It's late." "Indeed, and I apologize for the hour." The Reverend's face showed concern beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "May I come in? There's been an incident at the station." Curiosity overcame Thomas's desire for solitude. He stepped back, allowing the Reverend to enter the dim cottage. Following behind Porter was Sheriff Mills, his badge catching the lamplight. "What's this about?" Thomas asked, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance. Sheriff Mills removed his hat. "There's been a robbery at the station. Lady passenger from Boston got her purse snatched while waiting for someone to meet her. Lost everything. Money, papers, all of it." Thomas frowned. "I'm sorry to hear it, but what's it got to do with me?" Reverend Porter cleared his throat. "The lady in question is Miss Hannah Sullivan. Her father was my seminary classmate years ago. She came here on my invitation, expecting to take the teaching position at our school, which got filled last month," the sheriff added. "Mason's eldest girl took it. I was to meet her tomorrow," the Reverend continued, looking ashamed. "I had no idea she'd arrive on the late train. My wife and I have the parsonage full with my sister's family visiting from Philadelphia." Thomas sensed where this was heading. "And you want me to—" "What, exactly?" "Offer her shelter," Reverend Porter said plainly. "Just for tonight. She can take my sister's room tomorrow. But tonight, you want a single woman to stay here? With me?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Have you lost your mind, Reverend? You know how folks talk in this town." Sheriff Mills shifted uncomfortably. "It's just for one night, Blackwood. Unless you'd prefer I put her in the cell next to drunk Duncan." Thomas rubbed his aching head. Why me? Why not the Winters family? Mrs. Winters loves taking in strays. The Winters are in Harrisburg visiting their son, the Reverend explained. Please, Thomas. She has nowhere else to go. And she's waiting outside while you beg strangers to take her in? Thomas asked, moving toward the window. Sure enough, a slender figure stood by the sheriff's wagon, arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold night air. Something about her lonely silhouette against the moonlight stirred a memory. Himself, standing outside the doctor's house the night Emma died, not wanting to go home to an empty house. The crushing weight of having nowhere to belong. One night, Thomas said sharply. She takes William's old room, and you come get her first thing tomorrow. Relief washed over the Reverend's face. Thank you, Thomas. I knew we could count on your Christian charity. Don't mistake this for charity, Thomas growled. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. That's all. The men went to retrieve the woman, while Thomas hastily cleared old mining clothes from the small second bedroom. He hadn't entered it in years, but the faint smell of the lavender sachets Emma had made still clung to the air. William's wooden soldiers stood in formation on the shelf, guarding an empty bed. Hushed voices approached the door. Thomas straightened his shirt, suddenly conscious of the coal dust ingrained in the floorboards, the unwashed dishes in the sink. What must she think, being forced to stay with a stranger? A rough miner with bloodied knuckles and whiskey on his breath. Miss Sullivan, this is Mr. Thomas Blackwood, the Reverend introduced as they entered. He's kindly offered his spare room for the night. Thomas looked up, expecting to see fear or disgust on the woman's face. Instead, Hannah Sullivan met his gaze with quiet dignity. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with chestnut hair pulled back severely beneath a plain bonnet. Her gray traveling dress showed signs of a long journey, but she stood straight-backed, chin raised slightly despite her circumstances. I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement without pretension. I apologize for the imposition. Before Thomas could respond, the Reverend and Sheriff were making hasty goodbyes, promising to return in the morning, leaving him alone with this stranger in his home. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. The room's through there, Thomas finally said, gesturing awkwardly. It's not much, but it's clean. Thank you. She hesitated, clutching her small remaining bag. I should tell you that I have very little means to repay your kindness. The thief took nearly everything. Thomas shook his head. I'm not looking for payment. He moved to stoke the long-dead fire, needing something to do with his hands. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash. I'll be out here if you need anything. Hannah took a step toward the bedroom, then paused. Mr. Blackwood? He looked up from the hearth. I may be a stranger to you, but I know what grief looks like, she said softly. My father wore the same expression these past years. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for each other is to expect nothing in return. Before he could form a response, she disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door gently behind her. Thomas remained kneeling by the fireplace, feeling as though she'd seen straight through him in a way no one had since Emma died. As the first flames caught the kindling, Thomas wondered what desperate circumstances had brought Hannah Sullivan to Millfield, and why her simple words had cracked something open inside him that he'd spent years trying to keep sealed shut. The scent of coffee pulled Thomas from a dreamless sleep. For a moment, he thought Emma was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. Then reality crashed back. The hard chair he'd fallen asleep in, the crick in his neck, and the strange woman moving quietly around his kitchen. Hannah Sullivan stood at his stove, her hair neatly pinned back, wearing the same gray dress as the night before. She glanced over as he stirred. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the coffee pot. I thought it might help start the day. Thomas struggled to his feet, embarrassed to be caught sleeping in his clothes. You didn't have to do that. It seemed the least I could do. She poured a cup and offered it to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and he noticed a small ink stain on her right index finger. A teacher's mark. The coffee tasted better than anything he'd made for himself in years. Outside, the mining whistle blew, signaling the start of the day shift. "I should get to work," Thomas said, suddenly conscious of his unshaven face and rumpled clothes. "The Reverend will be by for you soon." Hannah nodded, a flash of worry crossing her features before she composed herself again. "Of course, I've straightened up a bit, if that's acceptable." For the first time, Thomas noticed the swept floor, the washed dishes drying by the sink. Small changes that made the cottage feel almost like a home again rather than merely a place to collapse between shifts. "You didn't need to do all that. I wanted to be useful," she replied simply. A thread of something beneath her calm exterior caught his attention. Desperation, perhaps. The look of someone trying very hard to prove their worth. Thomas hesitated by the door. "Miss Sullivan, if the Reverend doesn't come by, I'll manage," she cut in quickly. "I always do." At the mine, Thomas couldn't focus. His thoughts kept returning to Hannah Sullivan, alone in his cottage with nothing but the ghosts of his family for company. When Foreman Jenkins shouted at him for the third time about watching his work, Thomas made a decision. During the midday break, instead of eating with the other miners, he walked quickly to the parsonage. He found Reverend Porter in his study, looking harried. "Thomas, I was just about to send word to you. There's been a complication." "What kind of complication?" Thomas asked, already suspecting the answer. The Reverend sighed, removing his spectacles to clean them nervously. "My sister's family is staying another fortnight. Her husband has business in Pittsburgh, and she refuses to travel alone with the children. So there's no room for Miss Sullivan. I've sent letters to several families, but no one seems able to take her in. The boarding house is full with railroad workers, and Mrs. Clayton at the school is adamant about not wanting competition living in town." The Reverend looked miserable. If only the teaching position were still open. Miss Sullivan is well qualified. Her father ensured she received an excellent education. Thomas thought of Hannah's careful movements around his kitchen, her quiet dignity despite her circumstances. How long before she finds another position? That's the trouble. With her references stolen and winter approaching, it could be spring before another suitable position opens. "I've written to Boston for replacement documents, but these things take time." Reverend Porter looked at Thomas with sudden hope. Unless, Thomas knew that look. He'd seen it on the faces of would-be matchmakers around town for years. "Don't even think it, Reverend. You have the space, Thomas. The cottage has 2 bedrooms. It wouldn't be proper." "Which is precisely why I'm suggesting something more permanent." The Reverend leaned forward. "Marriage, Thomas." The word hung in the air between them like coal dust before a collapse. "Have you lost your mind?" Thomas finally managed. "Marry a woman I met last night? People marry for far less sensible reasons," the Reverend countered. "She needs security. You need." He hesitated. "What?" Thomas demanded. "What do I need?" "Not to be alone anymore," Porter said gently. "Everyone in town worries about you, Thomas. The drinking, the fights. Since Emma and William." "Don't speak their names," Thomas cut in sharply, rising from his chair. "I'm not marrying some stranger just because you've nowhere to put her." "At least consider it," the Reverend called as Thomas stormed toward the door. "Speak with her. Miss Sullivan is practical about her situation. This needn't be a love match, merely an arrangement of mutual benefit." Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "And what benefit would I get from such an arrangement?" "A respectable household again. Someone to care for the cottage while you work. Perhaps," the Reverend hesitated, "perhaps even children someday." The suggestion hit Thomas like a blow to the chest. Replace William? The very thought was blasphemy. "I'll find somewhere else for her to stay," Thomas said coldly, and left without another word. He didn't return to the mine. Instead, he walked the streets of Millfield, remembering when he'd first come here with Emma, full of hope for their future. The town had grown with the mine, company houses, a proper school, 2 churches now instead of 1. Everyone knew everyone else's business. By nightfall, Half the town would know Miss Sullivan had spent the night under his roof. The sun was setting when Thomas finally returned to the cottage. Smoke rose from the chimney. She'd kept the fire going. Through the window, he could see Hannah sitting at his table, bent over what appeared to be mending work, her face focused in the lamplight. Something about the scene stopped him cold. For 5 years, he'd returned to darkness and silence. Now there was warmth, light, the promise of another voice besides his own bouncing off the walls. It frightened him how much the sight affected him. Hannah looked up as he entered, setting aside her sewing. One of his shirts, he realized, the one with the torn sleeve he'd never bothered to fix. "I hope you don't mind," she said, echoing her words from that morning. "I found your mending basket." Thomas hung his coat by the door. "The Reverend won't be coming." Her hands stilled, but her expression revealed nothing. "I see. His sister's family is staying longer. There's no room for you at the parsonage." Hannah nodded slowly, absorbing this news. "I understand. I'll gather my things and go where?" Thomas asked more gruffly than he intended. Her spine straightened. "I still have a few coins. Perhaps the hotel." "The hotel won't take a single woman traveling alone without proper references," Thomas interrupted. "Not in this town." A flash of fear crossed her face before she mastered it. "Then I'll move on to the next town. There's a westbound train tomorrow." With what money? For what purpose? To knock on strangers' doors and hope for charity. The words came out harsher than he intended. Hannah rose from the chair, her composure finally cracking. "What would you have me do, Mr. Blackwood? Beg in the streets? I've lost everything. My father, my home, my prospects, my belongings. But I still have my dignity, and I will not impose where I'm not wanted." Her outburst shocked them both into silence. Thomas had not expected such fire beneath her calm exterior. It reminded him, painfully, of Emma's spirit. "The Reverend suggested an arrangement," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Hannah's eyes narrowed slightly. "What sort of arrangement?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, unable to look directly at her. "Marriage." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Hannah sank slowly back into the chair, her face unreadable. "I see," she said again, her voice measured. "A marriage of convenience." "It's not my idea," Thomas said quickly. "But he seems to think it would solve both our problems. You need somewhere to stay. I need." He trailed off, not sure what to say. "A housekeeper?" she supplied, with a hint of bitterness. "Company," Thomas admitted, surprising himself with the truth of it. "The town talks. They worry. If I had a wife again, they might stop looking at me like I'm about to throw myself down a mine shaft." Hannah studied him, her intelligent eyes taking his measure. "And what of affection, Mr. Blackwood? Of love?" Thomas looked away. "I buried those feelings with my Emma. I have none left to give." "Then we understand each other," she said quietly. "I don't seek romance either. My father's illness taught me that security is what matters in this world." His eyes returned to her face, searching for signs of distress or resignation. Instead, he found clear-eyed pragmatism. "You'd consider it, then? Marrying a coal miner you've known one day?" "I'd consider a respectable arrangement that provides shelter and purpose," she corrected. "In exchange, I would keep your home, prepare your meals, maintain appearances in town. A business arrangement, essentially." Thomas had not expected such cool logic. "What of children?" he asked bluntly, echoing the Reverend's earlier suggestion. A shadow crossed Hannah's face. "My father's illness required care these past 5 years. I'm 32, Mr. Blackwood. I've made my peace with certain realities." The frankness of her answer left him without words. This wasn't the tearful, grateful response the Reverend might have expected. Here was a woman negotiating terms, clear-eyed about what she offered and what she needed in return. "I should tell you," Thomas said roughly, "that I drink sometimes. More than I should. I noticed. And I'm not much for talking or church-going these days." Hannah folded her hands in her lap. I don't require conversation, Mr. Blackwood, nor do I expect to change your habits. I simply need a place in this world, and you're offering one. The practicality of it all struck Thomas as both admirable and terribly sad. Where was this woman's family? Her friends? How had she come to be so alone that marrying a stranger seemed a reasonable choice? Before he could ask any of these questions, a sharp knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to find Mrs. Winters on his step, her face tight with disapproval. "Mr. Blackwood," she said stiffly, peering past him to where Hannah sat. "I've just returned from Harrisburg to hear the most extraordinary rumors. The Reverend tells me Miss Sullivan is staying here." Thomas felt a flash of anger at the intrusion. Miss Sullivan needed accommodations for the night. Mrs. Winters's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Unchaperoned? In a bachelor's home? Really, Mr. Blackwood, I would have thought better of you." From behind him, Hannah's voice came clear and composed. "Mrs. Winters, I presume? How fortunate you've come by. Mr. Blackwood has just done me the honor of proposing marriage. We were discussing the arrangements when you knocked." Thomas turned in shock, but Hannah's face revealed nothing but calm certainty. She had made her decision, forcing his hand before the town gossip could spread further. Mrs. Winters's mouth fell open. "Marriage? But you've only just met." "Sometimes," Hannah said, rising to stand beside Thomas, "one knows quite quickly what path Providence has set before them." The older woman looked between them, suspicion warring with excitement at being the first to hear such news. "Well, the Reverend mentioned nothing of this when I stopped at the parsonage. We've only just decided," Thomas found himself saying, playing along with Hannah's swift maneuver. "In fact, we were about to call on Reverend Porter to discuss a ceremony." Mrs. Winters clutched her shawl tighter. "I see. Well, this is unexpected news indeed. I shall pray for your happiness." Her expression suggested she expected anything but happiness from such a hasty arrangement. After she left, Thomas turned to Hannah. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Hannah replied steadily. "By noon tomorrow, everyone in town would know I spent 2 nights under your roof. My reputation would be ruined, and yours questioned. This way, we control the narrative." Thomas studied this practical, surprising woman who had just tied her fate to his with one bold declaration. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Hannah looked around the small cottage, at Emma's rocking chair, at William's toys still scattered in corners, at the half-mended shirt on the table. Then she met his eyes directly. "No, Mr. Blackwood, it isn't what either of us wants. But sometimes life offers us necessities rather than desires." She offered her hand, as if to seal a business deal. "Shall we call on the Reverend before Mrs. Winters beats us there with the news?" Thomas took her hand, feeling the scholar's calluses on her fingertips, so different from Emma's work-roughened palms. As they walked to the parsonage in the gathering dusk, he wondered what Emma would think of this arrangement, and whether he was betraying her memory or finally honoring her last whispered request. "Live, Thomas. Don't die with me." The church bell's chime echoed across Millfield as Hannah straightened Thomas's collar. Her fingers worked quickly, businesslike, avoiding his eyes. 6 days. That's all it had taken from their first meeting to this moment. Standing in the parsonage parlor, about to speak vows neither had expected to say again. "There," Hannah said, stepping back to examine her work. "Presentable enough." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his Sunday suit, too tight across the shoulders after years unworn. "You don't have to go through with this." Hannah's expression remained carefully neutral. "The arrangements are made. Mrs. Winters has told half the town already. We could leave, start fresh somewhere else." A tiny furrow appeared between her brows, the only crack in her composure. "And face the same problems elsewhere?" "No, Mr. Blackwood. This is the most practical solution." The door opened before Thomas could respond. Reverend Porter entered, prayer book in hand, his wife following with a small bouquet of late autumn flowers. "A few neighbors have gathered," the Reverend said, smiling too brightly. "Word travels fast in Millfield." Of course it did. Thomas imagined the whispers that would follow. The grieving miner who married a stranger, the homeless teacher desperate enough to accept. He glanced at Hannah, wondering what she was thinking behind that carefully maintained dignity. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes. Thomas repeated the familiar words mechanically, his mind traveling back to another wedding day. Emma in her mother's dress, her smile bright enough to light the darkest mine shaft. When he slipped the plain gold band onto Hannah's finger, his mother's ring, the only thing of value he still possessed, her hand trembled slightly despite her composed expression. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Porter declared to the small gathering of curious onlookers. No one cheered. A few women dabbed at their eyes, whether from sentiment or pity, Thomas couldn't tell. The walk home passed in awkward silence. Hannah kept pace beside him, her new wedding band catching the weak December sunlight. Neighbors nodded as they passed, eager eyes following their progress through town. "We're quite the spectacle," Hannah observed quietly. "They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough," Thomas replied. At the cottage doorstep, Thomas hesitated. Some half-remembered wedding tradition nagged at him, something about thresholds. Before he could recall it, Hannah stepped past him into the house, solving the dilemma. Inside, the cottage looked different somehow. In the week since Hannah's arrival, small changes had transformed the space. The floors gleamed, scrubbed clean of years of coal dust. The windows sparkled, letting in more light than Thomas could remember. Emma's rocking chair had been moved to a cozy corner by the fire, a mending basket beside it as if it had always belonged there. "I hope you don't mind the changes," Hannah said, noticing his gaze. "I needed something to do while waiting." "It's your home now too," Thomas replied, the words feeling strange in his mouth. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. They were married, yet strangers, bound by law and necessity rather than affection. "I'll prepare supper," Hannah said finally, removing her bonnet and gloves. "I'll bring in more firewood," Thomas responded, grateful for a reason to step outside again. That night, they maintained separate bedrooms as agreed. Thomas lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about his home. From beyond the wall came the soft creak of a bed, then silence. He wondered if Hannah was also lying awake, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Just before dawn, Thomas rose quietly and dressed for the mine. In the kitchen, he found a lunch pail prepared, sitting on the table alongside a pot of coffee still warm from the embers. A note in neat handwriting leaned against the cup. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. I wasn't sure when you leave. I hope this is early enough." The simple thoughtfulness of it caught him off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to caring for himself, to expecting nothing, that this small gesture felt strangely intrusive, a reminder that his solitary existence had ended. The mine swallowed Thomas for 12 hours, the familiar darkness a comfort after the unsettling newness at home. His fellow miners, of course, had heard about the wedding. "So, Blackwood's got himself a missus," Jim Fuller said during their brief break, his tone somewhere between congratulation and mockery. "Pretty one too, they're saying." Thomas focused on his food, ignoring the comments. "Heard she's educated," another miner added. "What's she want with a coal man?" "Leave him be," old Harris grunted. "Man's got a right to some happiness after what he's been through." Happiness. The word echoed in Thomas's mind as he descended back into the mine shaft. Was that what this arrangement was supposed to bring? He'd given up on happiness the day they buried Emma. This marriage was about survival, both his and Hannah's. When Thomas returned home that evening, the cottage glowed with lamplight. Through the window, he could see Hannah at the table, bent over a pile of papers. He paused, watching her. This stranger who was now his wife. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling in a chestnut curtain as she worked. For a moment, she looked up from her task, her face unguarded, revealing a flash of worry before she noticed him at the window and quickly composed her features. Thomas entered, hanging his coat by the door. The warmth of the cottage wrapped around him, along with the unexpected scent of beef stew. "You're back," Hannah said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "I hope stew is acceptable." Mrs. Porter brought over some vegetables. "Stew is fine," Thomas replied, washing his hands at the basin. aware of how the coal dust never truly came clean. "What are you working on?" Hannah hesitated. "Lesson plans. Old habits, I suppose. For when Mrs. Clayton's position opens? Perhaps." She ladled stew into a bowl for him. Although Mrs. Porter mentioned the mining company might need a clerk for their office. Someone who can keep accounts and write correspondence. Thomas looked up in surprise. "You'd do that?" Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I would do whatever is necessary to contribute to this household. I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," Thomas said automatically, though the words rang hollow. Wasn't that exactly what he'd considered her when the Reverend first suggested this arrangement? A burden he'd taken on out of pity? They ate in silence, the ticking of the mantel clock marking the passage of time. This was marriage, Thomas thought grimly. Two strangers sharing food and space, bound by convenience rather than love. After supper, Hannah brought out a Bible, not Thomas's dust-covered one, but her own well-worn volume. "Would you mind if I read?" she asked. "It was my father's custom each evening." Thomas shrugged. "Do as you please." Her voice filled the cottage as she read, clear and steady, bringing the familiar verses to life in a way Thomas hadn't heard since childhood. He found himself listening despite his intentions, watching her face in the lamplight as she drew comfort from the ancient words. When she finished, Hannah closed the book carefully. "My father believed that even in our darkest moments, we are being prepared for something we cannot yet see." She looked up at Thomas. "What happened to your son, Mr. Blackwood?" The question caught him off guard. They had not spoken of William since their brief exchange that first night. "Why do you ask?" "Because his absence fills this house," Hannah replied simply. "And because I should know something of the family I've joined, even under these circumstances." Thomas stared into the fire, wondering how much to share. Finally, he began speaking, the words coming slowly at first, then faster. Telling of Emma's illness, the desperate need for money, sending William to the county orphanage, just until things improved. The fire that tore through the building one night while Thomas worked the late shift. "They never found his body," Thomas finished, his voice rough. "Some children escaped. They never knew exactly who was lost. For months, I searched neighboring towns, hoping." He fell silent, unable to continue. Hannah's face showed no pity, only a quiet understanding that somehow hurt worse. "How old would he be now?" 10, Thomas answered. "He'd be 10 years old." Hannah nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "Knowledge helps us avoid causing unnecessary pain to others." As she rose to prepare for bed, Thomas caught her wrist gently. "Hannah." She looked down at him, surprised by the use of her given name. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" he asked. "The truth." Hannah's gaze didn't waver. "Because I recognize desperation when I see it, Mr. Blackwood. And sometimes the drowning save each other." Long after she'd gone to her room, Thomas sat by the dying fire, turning her words over in his mind. The drowning saving each other. Was that what they were doing? And if so, would they pull each other up or drag each other deeper? February winds howled outside the small schoolhouse as Hannah adjusted her shawl. Inside, 20 children from the mining families huddled around the stove, clutching their primers with red-chilled fingers. "Sound it out, Peter," Hannah encouraged as a small boy struggled with his letters. "Remember what we practiced yesterday." Peter Mason, a coal miner's son with his father's stubborn jaw, frowned at the page. "Sati, cat." "Excellent." Hannah smiled, moving to the next child. 2 months of unofficial lessons in her kitchen had led to this opportunity, substituting for Mrs. Clayton, whose baby had arrived early. The regular teacher wouldn't return until spring, providing Hannah with temporary employment and purpose beyond her marriage. Through the window, Hannah caught sight of Thomas walking toward the mine entrance, lunch pail in hand. Even from a distance, his posture marked him, shoulders slightly hunched, as if perpetually bracing against a cave-in. They'd settled into an uneasy routine since their December wedding. Polite exchanges, separate rooms, shared meals where conversation remained superficial. a marriage in name that both pretended satisfied their needs. Yet sometimes Hannah caught Thomas watching her with an unreadable expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle. And sometimes, in unguarded moments like now, she found herself watching him too. "Mrs. Blackwood?" A small voice pulled her attention back to the classroom. "Yes, Sarah?" The girl held up her slate. "Is this right?" Hannah focused on the wobbly numbers, pushing thoughts of Thomas from her mind. This small teaching position offered her first taste of independence since arriving in Millfield. The pittance it paid went into a tin box she kept beneath her bed, security against whatever uncertain future awaited. When school dismissed, Hannah remained behind, preparing lessons for the following day. Snow began falling outside, thick flakes swirling in the growing darkness. She hadn't noticed how late it had grown until a knock came at the schoolhouse door. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the mothers collecting a forgotten lunch pail. Instead, Foreman Jenkins entered, removing his hat. His expression sent a chill through Hannah before he even spoke. "Mrs. Blackwood, there's been an accident at the mine." The world tilted sideways. Hannah gripped the edge of her desk. "Thomas." "He's alive," Jenkins said quickly, "but injured. Cave-in trapped 3 men. Your husband helped get them out before the support beams gave way." Hannah grabbed her shawl, heart hammering. "Where is he?" "Doc Martin's. I came straight away to fetch you." The walk to the doctor's house passed in a blur of swirling snow and racing thoughts. Why did she care so much? Their marriage was an arrangement, nothing more. Yet her hands trembled as Jenkins knocked on the doctor's door. Dr. Martin, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, let them in. "Mrs. Blackwood, your husband's in the back room. Broken ribs, shoulders dislocated, but he'll mend." Relief made Hannah's knees weak. "May I see him?" Thomas lay on a narrow examination table, his face ashen beneath the cold dust, eyes closed. His shirt had been cut away, revealing purple bruising spreading across his chest and shoulder. One hand was bandaged, but the other lay open at his side. Hannah moved forward silently, not wanting to wake him if he'd found relief in sleep. His eyelids fluttered open as she approached. "Hannah!" His voice was rough with pain. "I'm here," she said softly, unsure whether to take his hand. Thomas solved her dilemma by reaching for her, his fingers closing around hers with surprising strength. "The others." "2 made it out," Dr. Martin answered from the doorway. "Harris didn't. You did everything possible, Blackwood." Thomas closed his eyes again, grief washing over his features. "Not enough." Hannah squeezed his hand gently. "The foreman says you saved 2 lives. At the cost of another." Dr. Martin cleared his throat. "He'll need rest. Few weeks at least before he can return to work. You can take him home now, but he'll need help. Shouldn't be lifting anything, not with those ribs." The reality of what that meant sank in. Weeks of lost wages. Thomas would need care. Their careful distance would be impossible to maintain. "I understand," Hannah said, her mind already calculating what remained in her tin box, how they would manage. Getting Thomas home through the snowstorm took all Hannah's strength. He leaned heavily against her, each step clearly agonizing despite his attempts to hide it. Inside the cottage, the fire had died to embers. "Bedroom," Hannah directed, guiding him toward his room. "You need to lie down." "I can sleep in the chair," Thomas argued weakly. "Don't be foolish," Hannah replied, her tone allowing no argument. "You need proper rest." Once she had him settled on the bed, Hannah built up the fire, prepared a tisane for pain that her father had taught her, and gathered clean cloths to wash the cold dust from Thomas's skin. Only when these practical tasks were complete did she allow herself to consider their altered circumstances. "The mine will provide some compensation," Thomas said, watching her movements. "Not much, but something." Hannah nodded, bringing the steaming cup to his bedside. "I have some savings from teaching. We'll manage." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "You've been saving?" "Of course," Hannah replied matter-of-factly. "One must always prepare for difficulties." A hint of admiration crossed his face. "Always practical." Necessity teaches pragmatism. Hannah helped him sit up enough to drink, her hand supporting his back. The intimacy of the gesture was unavoidable, her fingers feeling the heat of his skin through the thin shirt Dr. Martin had provided. Thomas drank slowly, wincing as each swallow disturbed his ribs. When he finished, Hannah took the cup, their fingers brushing. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Run back for the others when the supports were failing?" Thomas looked surprised by the question. Couldn't leave them, even knowing the danger? Especially then. His eyes met hers, suddenly intense despite his pain. "You think I have a death wish?" It wasn't a question. Hannah set the cup aside, choosing her words carefully. "I think you value your life less than others do. And that bothers you?" A challenge in his voice now. "It complicates our arrangement," Hannah replied, falling back on practicality. "I can't fulfill my part if you're not here to fulfill yours." Thomas studied her face. "Is that the only reason?" The question hung between them, demanding a truth Hannah wasn't prepared to examine. Before she could formulate a response, Thomas's face contorted in pain as he shifted position. "You need rest," Hannah said, grateful for the interruption. "We can discuss this tomorrow." But Thomas caught her wrist as she turned to leave. "Hannah!" She looked back, finding his eyes clearer than she'd ever seen them, pain stripping away the usual guardedness. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming, for helping." "We made a promise," Hannah reminded him, gently extracting her wrist. "For better or worse." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "So we did." That night, Hannah slept poorly in her small bedroom, listening for sounds of distress from Thomas. Their careful arrangement had been disrupted, forcing a closer proximity than either had anticipated. She'd touched him more in one evening than in 2 months of marriage, had spoken more honestly, had felt more. Near dawn, Hannah woke to the sound of Thomas calling out. Not for her, but for William. The name tore from him in his sleep, raw with grief. Without thinking, Hannah rose and went to his door, opening it quietly. Thomas thrashed weakly in the bed, trapped in a nightmare, his injured ribs preventing him from moving freely. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. "William!" he called again, the name breaking in the middle. Hannah moved to his bedside, placing a cool hand on his forehead. "Shoo!" she soothed. "It's just a dream." Thomas stilled at her touch, his eyes opening but unfocused. "Emma?" The name of his dead wife pierced Hannah unexpectedly. "No," she said softly. "It's Hannah." Confusion clouded his face for a moment before recognition returned. "Hannah," he repeated as if testing the name. "I was dreaming." "I know," she said. "Try to rest." As she turned to leave, Thomas caught her hand. "Stay," he whispered. "Please." Hannah hesitated only briefly before pulling the rocking chair closer to his bedside. She sat, keeping her hand in his. "I'll stay until you sleep." Thomas's eyes drifted closed, his breathing gradually steadying. Long after his grip relaxed, Hannah remained, watching the rise and fall of his chest, troubled by the unfamiliar emotions stirring within her. This was not part of their arrangement. Their marriage was supposed to be practical, distant, a solution to mutual problems. Yet here she sat, holding a sleeping man's hand, feeling protective and something dangerously close to tenderness. As dawn light crept into the room, Hannah carefully extracted her hand and returned to her own bed. Whatever was happening between them, she couldn't afford to examine it too closely, not when her true purpose in Millfield remained unfulfilled. A secret she carried like a stone in her heart, growing heavier with each passing day of deception. "Letter for you, Mrs. Blackwood." Hannah glanced up from her desk at the schoolhouse to see Jimmy Wells, the postmaster's son, holding out an envelope. Her heart quickened at the sight of the Pittsburgh postmark. "Thank you, Jimmy," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she accepted it. The boy lingered, clearly hoping for a copper penny for his trouble. Hannah searched her pocket and found one, which sent him skipping away with a gap-toothed grin. She stared at the letter, afraid to open it. 3 months of correspondence with orphanages and children's homes across Pennsylvania had yielded nothing but disappointment. This latest reply from a Catholic orphanage in Pittsburgh might be no different. Outside, March winds rattled the schoolhouse windows. The temporary teaching position had become permanent when Mrs. Clayton decided not to return after her baby's birth. Hannah's small salary helped during Thomas's recovery, which was taking longer than expected. His ribs had healed, but the mining company doctor worried about his breathing. The cave-in dust had worsened the coal already in his lungs. Hannah tucked the letter into her sleeve. Better to read it at home, away from curious eyes. She turned her attention back to grading arithmetic lessons, but her thoughts kept straying to the hidden envelope. At home, Thomas sat by the window, whittling a small wooden horse. The weeks of enforced rest had been difficult for him, a man accustomed to physical labor suddenly confined to the cottage. Hannah had discovered his skill with carving quite by accident, finding old toys he'd made for William. Encouraging him to take it up again had given him purpose during recovery. "How were the children today?" he asked, looking up as she entered. The simple domesticity of the question made Hannah pause. Somewhere in these months of caring for Thomas, of helping him dress when his shoulder wouldn't cooperate, of reading to him during long evenings by the fire, something had shifted between them. The careful distance had narrowed. They still maintained separate bedrooms, but the cottage no longer felt divided into his space and hers. "The usual mix of eager and reluctant scholars," Hannah replied, removing her shawl. "Peter Mason has finally mastered his letters." Thomas nodded, returning to his carving. "His father will be pleased. Jim's always wanted better for his boy than mining." Hannah busied herself preparing supper, the letter burning against her skin where she'd hidden it. Only when Thomas stepped outside to bring in firewood did she quickly retrieve it, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. "Dear Mrs. Blackwood," it began. "In response to your inquiry about children relocated following the Westmoreland County Orphanage fire of 1880, we have consulted our records as requested. A boy matching your description was indeed brought to our care by a Mr. and Mrs. Carter." Hannah's breath caught. After months of dead ends, finally a trace. The letter continued. "The Carters had initially hoped to adopt the child but found themselves unable to provide for him when Mr. Carter lost his position. The boy was transferred to St. Mary's Home in Harrisburg approximately 3 years ago. We have forwarded your inquiry to them and included their direction below." Hannah pressed the letter to her chest, heart racing. Could it be William? The timing matched. The Carters had taken in a boy during the confusion following the fire. A boy whose description matched what Thomas had told her of his son. The door opened as Thomas returned with an armload of wood. Hannah hastily tucked the letter into her pocket, guilt flooding her cheeks with color. How could she tell him she'd been searching without his knowledge? That she'd recognized William's name from her time as a teacher's assistant at that very orphanage? That she'd come to Millfield not just because of the teaching position, but because she'd been following a trail that had gone cold? "Hannah!" Thomas's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you unwell? You're flushed." "Just the heat from the stove," she lied, turning back to the pot she was stirring. The weight of her secrets sat heavy as stone in her stomach. Each day that passed made it harder to confess the truth. That night, after Thomas had retired to his room, Hannah sat at the kitchen table writing a response to St. Mary's Home. She needed to be careful, ask for information without revealing too much. If this boy was William, she wanted absolute certainty before giving Thomas hope that might be crushed. A floorboard creaked behind her. Hannah startled, quickly covering her writing with a book. "Can't sleep?" Thomas asked, standing in the doorway of his bedroom. In the lamplight, she could see how thin he remained, his collarbone prominent beneath his nightshirt. "Just finishing some schoolwork," Hannah replied, hating how easily lies now came to her lips. Thomas moved to the stove, adding a small log to keep the fire through the night. "You work too hard," says the man who nearly died saving others, Hannah countered with a small smile. Thomas's eyes met hers, serious despite her light tone. "I've been thinking about that, about what you said." "What did I say?" "That I value my life less than others do." He sat across from her at the table. You were right. Hannah set down her pen, giving him her full attention. These moments of openness from Thomas were rare, precious things. After Emma died, after William was lost, he continued, there didn't seem much point in caring whether I lived or died. The mine was as good a place as any to wait for the end. And now? Hannah asked softly. Thomas studied his hands, a craftsman's hands, she realized, not just a miner's, capable of creating beauty as well as wresting coal from the earth. Now I'm not so sure, he admitted. These past months, having someone waiting when I return home. He looked up, meeting her eyes. It matters. Hannah felt a tightness in her chest. How could she continue deceiving this man who was finally beginning to live again? Yet how could she tell him she'd been investigating behind his back, nurturing hopes that might prove false? The company's doctor says I can return to work next week, Thomas continued, unaware of her inner conflict. Not in the deep shafts yet, but above ground. It's less pay, but safer. That's wonderful news, Hannah said, meaning it despite her distraction. It's because of you. Thomas's hand moved across the table, not quite touching hers but close. Having you here, it's given me reason to be careful. The simple admission hung between them, changing the air in the small cottage. Hannah was acutely aware of how alone they were, how the late hour created an intimacy that daylight would have prevented. Thomas, she began, uncertain what she meant to say. He stood abruptly, as if suddenly conscious of the moment's fragility. Good night, Hannah. Don't work too late. After he'd gone, Hannah looked down at her half-written letter, then at the closed door of Thomas's bedroom. When had this arrangement, this marriage of convenience, become something she feared losing? And what would happen to this fragile trust when her secrets finally came to light? The next morning, Hannah walked to the post office before school, mailing her letter to Harrisburg. As spring softened the Pennsylvania hillsides, a strange mixture of hope and dread bloomed within her. She found herself watching Thomas more closely, seeing him anew each day as he regained strength, as life gradually returned to his eyes. One evening, returning from school, Hannah found Thomas deep in conversation with Reverend Porter at their kitchen table. The men fell silent as she entered, an unmistakable signal of a discussion not meant for her ears. Reverend, she acknowledged, removing her shawl. This is an unexpected pleasure. Mrs. Blackwood, he replied with a nod. I was just discussing a matter with your husband. Church business. Thomas's expression was unreadable as the Reverend made his goodbyes. Only when they were alone did he speak. The Reverend brought news of a mining accident in a neighboring town, Thomas explained, watching her carefully. An orphanage fire was mentioned. It seemed familiar. Hannah's blood ran cold. What orphanage? Westmoreland County. 5 years ago. Thomas's eyes never left her face. The Reverend remembered I'd lost my son there and thought I might want to contribute to the families affected by this new tragedy. Hannah busied herself with the kettle, trying to hide her trembling hands. That's very thoughtful of him. Hannah. Thomas's voice stopped her movements. When I mentioned William's name, the Reverend had the strangest reaction. He said you'd asked about the Westmoreland fire months ago, before we were married. Said you'd specifically inquired about children who might have escaped. The kettle slipped from Hannah's grasp, clattering against the stove but thankfully not spilling. She turned slowly to face him, reading the confusion and dawning suspicion in his eyes. Why would you ask about that fire, Hannah? Thomas asked quietly. Why would you ask about missing children before you even knew me? The moment Hannah had dreaded for months had arrived. No more secrets. No more evasions. But as she opened her mouth to explain, a sharp knock came at the door. Thomas held her gaze a moment longer before answering it. Foreman Jenkins stood on their doorstep, hat in hand. Blackwood. There's been a collapse in the north shaft. Men trapped. We need every able body for rescue. Thomas turned back to Hannah, conflict clear on his face, the need for answers warring with the urgency of the situation. Go, Hannah said softly. We'll talk when you return. As Thomas grabbed his coat, he paused beside her. "Promise me." Hannah nodded, words stuck in her throat as she watched him hurry into the gathering dusk. The truth would wait a few more hours. But she wondered, as she watched his retreating figure, whether their careful life together would survive it. Mud sucked at Thomas's boots as he helped carry an injured miner from the collapsed shaft. Rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the rescue effort into a brutal battle against both earth and water. His lungs burned with each breath, a reminder that he wasn't fully healed. The company doctor would have his hide for joining the rescue crew, but Thomas couldn't stand by while men were trapped. "That's the last of them," Foreman Jenkins called, his voice barely audible above the downpour. "7 out, 2 unaccounted for." Thomas wiped rain from his eyes, squinting into the darkness. "We're certain? No one else?" Jenkins shook his head grimly. "Shaft's completely blocked now. If McGuire and Donovan are still in there—" He didn't finish the thought. A wave of exhaustion hit Thomas as the adrenaline drained away. He'd been working for nearly 6 hours straight, ignoring the protests of his healing body. Now, in the gray light of dawn, he felt every bruise, every strain. But there was something else driving him homeward through the mud and rain. Hannah's face when he'd confronted her about the orphanage fire. The shock, the guilt, and something else. Fear? Sorrow? He couldn't name it, but he knew their conversation couldn't wait any longer. The cottage was silent when Thomas entered, dripping rainwater onto the clean floor. He expected Hannah to be asleep at this early hour, but she sat at the kitchen table, fully dressed, hands clasped around a cup of cold tea. Her face was pale, eyes shadowed with a night of waiting. "The men?" she asked immediately. "5 injured, 2 missing, likely dead," Thomas answered, removing his sodden coat. "The others will recover." Hannah nodded, rising to stoke the banked fire. "You need dry clothes and something hot to drink." Thomas caught her arm as she passed. "Hannah, we need to talk." She didn't resist, but he felt the tension in her body. "Yes, we do. Why were you asking about the Westmoreland fire?" Thomas repeated his question from the previous evening. "Why were you asking about missing children before you came to Millfield?" Hannah took a deep breath, seeming to gather courage. "Because I worked there, Thomas. I was teaching at the Westmoreland County Orphanage when it burned." The revelation hit Thomas like a blow to the chest. He released her arm, staggering slightly. "You were there? The night of the fire?" Hannah nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "I'd been hired as a teacher's assistant 3 weeks before. When the fire started, I helped evacuate the children. In the confusion, several were taken by passing families before proper records could be made." Thomas's mind raced, trying to process this information. Did you know William?" "My son." "Not by name," Hannah answered carefully. "Not then. There was a boy with a crescent-shaped birthmark below his right ear. He was taken by a couple traveling west." Thomas's hand went automatically to his own ear, where the same crescent mark hid beneath his hair. A family trait passed from father to son. "William had such a mark," he whispered. "I know." Hannah moved toward the small desk where she kept her teaching materials. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a bundle of letters. "I've been writing to orphanages along the likely routes since before I came to Millfield." All this time, Thomas felt as though the ground were shifting beneath him. "You've been searching for my son without telling me?" Hannah held out the letters with a trembling hand. "At first, I didn't know you were his father. When the Reverend asked me to stay here that first night, he only mentioned you had lost a child. It was only after our arrangement, when I saw William's portrait, that I realized the connection." Thomas took the letters, scanning the top one with disbelief. "Why keep it secret? Why not tell me?" "I was afraid," Hannah admitted, her composure finally cracking. "Afraid of giving you false hope. Afraid you would think I'd married you because of your connection to the boy, that I'd manipulated the situation somehow." Thomas sank into a chair, the weight of her words, of the possibility they contained, overwhelming him. "Have you found him?" he asked, his voice hardly more than a whisper. Hannah knelt beside his chair, her face alight with cautious hope. I believe so. A boy matching William's description was taken in by a family named Carter. They kept him for 2 years before financial hardship forced them to place him in another orphanage in Harrisburg. I've written to confirm it's him. We're waiting for their reply. Thomas stared at her, emotions warring within him. Anger at the deception, desperate hope that his son might be alive, and bewilderment at Hannah's role in it all. Why? He asked finally. Why would you do this? Search for years for a child you barely knew. Hannah looked down at her clasped hands. After the fire, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The faces of those missing children haunted me. I took a position at my father's church school, but every spare moment, I wrote letters, followed rumors. When my father fell ill, I cared for him, but continued searching whenever possible. She looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. When he died, I had nowhere to go. The Reverend's letter offering a teaching position in Millfield seemed providential. A chance to continue my search in the area where one of the families had been heading. So our marriage was just convenient for your search? Thomas asked, a new hurt blooming. No. Hannah reached for his hand, then stopped herself. No, Thomas. Our marriage was exactly what we agreed upon, a practical arrangement benefiting us both. My search for the missing children for your William was separate. A promise I made to myself years ago. Thomas stood abruptly, needing distance to think. The revelation that Hannah had been at the orphanage, had potentially seen William alive after he believed his son lost forever. It was too much to process. I need air, he said roughly, moving toward the door. Thomas, please. Hannah's voice stopped him. I know I should have told you sooner. I was wrong to keep this from you. But now we might have a chance to find him, to bring your son home. Thomas turned back, seeing the desperation in her face, the genuine regret. How can I trust anything you say now? Our entire marriage has been built on this secret. Not our entire marriage, Hannah replied softly. The foundation may have been practical, but what we've built these past months, the care, the respect, She hesitated, then continued more firmly. That has been real, Thomas. At least for me. Before Thomas could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. Hannah opened it to find Jimmy Wells again, holding another letter. Special delivery, Mrs. Blackwood. The boy announced importantly. All the way from Harrisburg. Ma said to bring it straight away since you've been asking after it. Hannah thanked him with another penny, then stood holding the envelope, her hands visibly shaking. She looked at Thomas, a question in her eyes. Open it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The letter was brief, but its contents changed everything. The director of St. Mary's Home confirmed that a boy matching William's description, age, appearance, and the distinctive crescent birthmark, had indeed been in their care until recently. The boy had spoken often of his father, a coal miner, who would come for him someday. Most significantly, the boy had been placed just 2 months earlier with a farming family outside Cleveland. He's alive? Thomas whispered, the world tilting around him. My son is alive. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. Yes. Thomas sank back into the chair, overwhelmed. 5 years of grief, of guilt, of believing his son lost forever, and now this sudden, miraculous hope. We have to go to him. I have to see for myself. We will, Hannah promised, as soon as the roads are passable again. Thomas looked up at her, seeing her anew. Not just the practical woman he'd married for convenience, but someone who had dedicated years to finding lost children, who had secretly worked to reunite him with his son. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked again, still struggling to understand. Hannah sat across from him, her face open in a way it had never been before. Because I was afraid. Of what? Of giving you hope that might prove false. Of you believing I'd manipulated this marriage somehow. She paused, vulnerability clear in her eyes. And lately of losing what we've built together. The confession hung between them, changing the air in the small cottage. Thomas studied her face, the face that had become so familiar these past months. The woman who had cared for him when he was injured, who had brought warmth back to his home, who had apparently been searching for his lost son even before she knew him. "What exactly have we built, Hannah?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze steadily. "I don't know, but it's more than what we agreed to that day in December." Thomas nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her words. Their practical arrangement had evolved into something neither had anticipated. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared meals and conversations, small kindnesses and considerations. Not love, perhaps, but something that might someday grow into it. "We leave for Cleveland as soon as the weather clears," Thomas decided. Together. Hannah's relief was visible, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Together," she agreed. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Thomas reached for Hannah's hand across the table. Their fingers intertwined as they began making plans for the journey that might bring William home. A journey that would either strengthen their unexpected bond or reveal it as something built on shifting sand. As Thomas lay awake that night, his mind whirled with possibilities. His son, alive. A chance to be a father again. And Hannah, the woman he'd married out of pity and convenience, had made it possible. Whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same between them. The question that kept him from sleep was whether that change would heal the wounds of the past or create new ones neither could overcome. "How much further?" Thomas asked, peering through the buggy's rain-spattered window. April showers had turned Ohio's countryside into a patchwork of muddy fields and swollen creeks, making travel slow and difficult. "According to the last signpost, about 5 miles to the Carter farm," Hannah replied, consulting the carefully drawn map provided by St. Mary's home. 3 days of travel had left them both exhausted, train from Pittsburgh to Cleveland, then this rented buggy for the final stretch into farming country. Thomas nodded, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left Millfield, his mind clearly racing ahead to the moment he might see William again. 5 years was a lifetime to a child. Would his son even remember him? Hannah watched Thomas's profile against the gray landscape, noting the tension in his jaw, the nervous way he straightened his collar for the 10th time that hour. In the weeks since her revelation about searching for William, their relationship had shifted into something undefined. Not quite the practical arrangement it had started as, but fragile in its newness. "What if he doesn't want to come with us?" Thomas asked suddenly, voicing the fear that had clearly been haunting him. Hannah chose her words carefully. "The Carters have had him only a few months, and from what the orphanage wrote, he's never stopped speaking of you." Thomas turned to her, vulnerability clear in his eyes. "And what of you? Are you prepared to become mother to a 10-year-old boy you've never met?" The question caught Hannah off guard. In all her searching, all her planning, she'd focused on reuniting father and son. The reality that she would play a role in William's life had remained abstract until now. "I'm prepared to try," she answered honestly. "The rest we'll figure out together." The buggy crested a hill, revealing a modest farmhouse nestled in a valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, chickens pecked in the muddy yard, and a boy, a thin child of about 10, was visible chopping kindling near the barn. Thomas went completely still, his breath catching audibly. "William," he whispered, though the child was too far away to see clearly. Hannah touched his arm gently. "Remember what we agreed. We speak with the Carters first, explain the situation. No rushing." Thomas nodded mechanically, his eyes never leaving the distant figure. As they approached the farm, a sturdy woman stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the weak spring sunlight. A man emerged from the barn, moving to stand protectively near the boy, who had stopped his chores to watch the approaching buggy. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" Hannah called as their buggy stopped in the yard. "That's us," the farmer replied cautiously. "Don't get many visitors out this way." Hannah descended first, helping Thomas down. His legs seemed unsteady as he stared at the boy, who had moved closer to Mr. Carter. "I'm Hannah Blackwood, and this is my husband, Thomas. We've corresponded with St. Mary's home about a boy placed in your care." Mrs. Carter's expression changed immediately, a mixture of understanding and wariness crossing her weathered face. "You'd better come inside," she said, gesturing toward the house. Thomas hesitated, his gaze still fixed on the boy, who was studying them with obvious curiosity. The child's hair was lighter than Thomas remembered, but the shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, unmistakably familiar. "Is that him?" Thomas asked hoarsely. "Is that William?" The boy's eyes widened at the name. Mr. Carter placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "We call him Will here. Had no family name when he came to us." Mrs. Carter ushered them all inside, where a kettle already steamed on the stove. The farmhouse kitchen was simple but clean, with a worn Bible prominently displayed on the table. "Will, fetch some more wood for the fire," Mrs. Carter instructed, clearly wanting a moment to speak with the visitors alone. The boy, William, nodded and slipped outside, casting a final curious glance at Thomas as he went. Once the door closed, Mrs. Carter turned to them directly. "You're claiming to be the boy's father?" Thomas nodded, finding his voice with difficulty. "My son was placed in Westmoreland County Orphanage when his mother died. There was a fire. They told me he was lost." "He survived," Mr. Carter confirmed. "We found him wandering with other children after the fire. Took him in, meaning to raise him as our own." The farmer's expression grew pained. "Then I lost my position at the mill. Couldn't provide proper. So you placed him at St. Mary's," Hannah supplied gently. Mrs. Carter nodded, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Hardest thing we ever did. When the Harrisons couldn't keep him either, we got a second chance." Her eyes filled with tears. "He's a good boy, smart, helps without complaint. Do you have proof he's yours?" Mr. Carter asked Thomas directly. Thomas reached into his coat, retrieving a small daguerreotype, William at 5, sitting on Thomas's knee. The boy's face, though younger, was unmistakably the same. "He has a birthmark," Thomas added quietly, "crescent-shaped, below his right ear. Family mark. My father had it. I have it. My son has it." The Carters exchanged glances, confirmation passing silently between them. "He talks about you," Mrs. Carter admitted softly. "His pa, the miner, said you'd come for him someday." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed. "I never stopped looking," he whispered. "Never in my heart." The door opened as William returned with an armload of wood. He stopped short, sensing the emotional weight in the room. "Will," Mrs. Carter said gently, "this man has come a very long way to see you. He believes he might be your father." The boy's arms tightened around the firewood, his expression guarded but hope flickering in his eyes that matched Thomas's exactly. "My pa worked in the mines," William said cautiously. "He was coming back for me after my ma died." Thomas took a step forward, then stopped, afraid of frightening the child. "Your mother's name was Emma," he said, voice thick with emotion. "She made lavender sachets for your clothes. You had a wooden horse I carved for your 3rd birthday. You were afraid of thunderstorms." With each detail, William's eyes grew wider. The firewood tumbled forgotten to the floor. "Pa," he whispered. Something broke open in Thomas then. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before his son. "William," he breathed, not touching the boy yet, letting him decide. William raised a trembling hand to Thomas's ear, pushing aside his hair to reveal the crescent birthmark that matched his own. "You came," he said, wonder and accusation mingling in his voice. "You really came." "I never stopped looking," Thomas repeated, tears tracking unashamedly down his face. "Never stopped hoping." William launched himself into his father's arms then, 5 years of separation collapsing in an instant. Thomas held him fiercely, his large hands cradling his son's head as if he might disappear again. Hannah stood apart, witnessing the reunion with tears in her own eyes. Mrs. Carter moved to stand beside her, the 2 women watching the miracle unfold. "You're his new mother?" Mrs. Carter asked softly. Hannah hesitated. "I'm Thomas's wife," she answered carefully. "I helped find William. The rest, that's for William to decide." Hours later, after explanations and tears, After William had shown Thomas his small collection of treasures, rocks and feathers and a tin soldier with one arm missing, the question of what happened next arose. "We want you to come home with us," Thomas told his son, seated beside him at the carter's table. "Back to Millfield, if that's what you want." William looked uncertainly between the Carters, who had been kind to him, and the father he'd never stopped believing would come. "What about school?" he asked. "Mrs. Carter's been teaching me my letters." Hannah spoke then, for the first time addressing William directly. "I'm the teacher at Millfield School," she said. "All the mining children attend." William studied her curiously. "Are you really my new mother?" The directness of the question made all the adults shift uncomfortably. Hannah met his gaze honestly. "I married your father this past winter," she explained. "We've been searching for you together. I would be honored to be part of your family, but I understand that will take time." William considered this with a child's remarkable acceptance of complex situations. "Did you know my real mother?" Hannah shook her head. "No. But your father has told me she was kind and brave and loved you very much." William nodded, satisfied with this answer for now. "Can I bring my collections?" he asked, turning back to Thomas. "Mrs. Carter says a man needs his important things." "Every last one," Thomas promised, his voice rough with emotion. That night, William slept in a small trundle in the Carter spare room where Thomas and Hannah had been offered lodging. As the boy's breathing deepened into sleep, Hannah watched Thomas watching his son, memorizing the child's features as if afraid he might vanish. "He has your eyes," Hannah whispered, "and your determined chin." Thomas glanced up, a vulnerability in his expression Hannah had never seen before. "Thank you," he said simply, "for finding him, for bringing him back to me." Hannah nodded, unsure how to respond to the raw gratitude in his voice. In the quiet farmhouse, with William's steady breathing the only sound, something shifted between them again. Deeper than their practical arrangement, more honest than their recent cautious interactions. "What happens when we return to Millfield?" Hannah asked quietly. "To our arrangement?" Thomas considered the question, his gaze returning to his sleeping son. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it can't be the same, can it?" "No," Hannah agreed. "It can't." The acknowledgement hung between them, a recognition that finding William had changed everything, had forced them to confront the nature of their marriage in ways neither had anticipated. "We should sleep," Hannah said finally. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As she settled onto her side of the bed, still maintaining the careful distance they'd established, Hannah wondered what awaited them back in Millfield. Their practical marriage had served its purpose. William was found. The secret search was over. What remained to be seen was whether what had grown between them in these months was strong enough to build something new. A real family for a boy who had lost so much, and perhaps a real marriage for two people who had begun with nothing but necessity and convenience. Millfield's church bells rang out across the valley, summoning worshippers for Sunday service. Hannah adjusted William's collar one last time, smoothing down a cowlick that refused to be tamed. "Do I have to go?" the boy asked, fidgeting in his new clothes. 2 weeks back in Millfield had brought many adjustments. A new home, new town, new faces watching his every move with curious eyes. "Your father's waiting," Hannah replied gently. "First impressions matter in a small town." William sighed dramatically but nodded. In the short time since his return, Hannah had discovered his quick mind, his endless questions, and his stubborn streak, all qualities that reminded her of Thomas. Outside the cottage, Thomas waited patiently, dressed in his Sunday best. The changes in him since William's return were remarkable. He stood straighter, smiled more readily, and had not touched a drop of whiskey. The mining company had permanently assigned him to surface work, recognizing his skill in detecting unsafe conditions after the last cave-in. "Ready?" Thomas asked as they emerged. His eyes met Hannah's over William's head, a silent communication that had developed between them since their journey to Ohio. The walk to church attracted attention from every porch and garden they passed. News of William's miraculous return had spread through Millfield like wildfire. Some called it a miracle, Others whispered about Hannah's convenient appearance just months before the boy was found. Small towns thrived on such mysteries. Reverend Porter greeted them at the church steps, his face alight with genuine joy. "The prodigal returns," he said, clasping Thomas's shoulder. "God works in mysterious ways." "Indeed he does," Thomas replied, his hand protectively on William's shoulder. Inside, the congregation made little effort to hide their curiosity. Mrs. Winters sniffed disapprovingly when William accidentally kicked the pew in front of them, while her unmarried daughter Catherine studied Hannah with narrowed eyes. "Everyone's staring," William whispered loudly enough for nearby congregants to hear. "They're just happy for us," Hannah assured him, though the scrutiny made her own shoulders tense. After the service, the expected gathering occurred on the church lawn, neighbors approaching to welcome William home, to congratulate Thomas, to assess whether the strange circumstances of the Blackwood family warranted further gossip. "He has your look about him, Blackwood," old Harris observed gruffly. "Got that same determined jaw." "Spitting image," Mrs. Porter agreed, patting William's head as if he were a much younger child. William endured the attention with surprising grace, answering questions politely but pressing closer to Thomas with each new face that approached. Hannah stood slightly apart, watching father and son navigate this social gauntlet together. Though she'd accompanied William to school each day, helped him settle into the cottage, and tended to his needs alongside Thomas, she remained uncertain of her place in this reunion story. "Quite the miracle worker, aren't you, Mrs. Blackwood?" Hannah turned to find Mrs. Winters beside her, a calculating smile on her thin lips. "Finding the boy so quickly after marrying his father," the older woman continued, "almost as if you knew where to look all along." The implication hung in the air between them, the same whispers Hannah had heard around town since their return with William. "God guided our search," Hannah replied evenly, borrowing the Reverend's phrasing. "We're grateful for his providence." Mrs. Winters pursed her lips. "Indeed, Providence has been most kind to you, Mrs. Blackwood. A teaching position, a husband, and now a ready-made family. Quite the rise in circumstances for a woman who arrived with nothing but a borrowed dress." Before Hannah could respond, William appeared at her side, slipping his small hand into hers with natural ease. "Pa says we can go home now," he announced. "He promised to show me how to carve a whistle." Mrs. Winters's expression softened slightly at the boy's innocent interruption. "You must be very happy to be home, William." The boy looked up at Hannah, then back at the nosy neighbor. "I am," he said simply. "I got my pa back, and Hannah reads better stories than anyone at the orphanage." The simple declaration, spoken with a child's honesty, left Mrs. Winters momentarily speechless. Hannah squeezed William's hand gently, unexpectedly touched by his endorsement. As they walked home, William between them, Hannah found herself studying Thomas's profile. The changes in him went beyond the physical improvements. There was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before, even in the quiet moments they'd shared during his recovery. "What shall we have for Sunday dinner?" Hannah asked as they approached the cottage. "Chicken and dumplings," William suggested immediately, "like Mrs. Carter used to make." A shadow crossed Thomas's face at the mention of the farm family who had briefly cared for his son. The Carters had released William with surprising grace, recognizing the boy's rightful place was with his father. Still, William spoke of them often, and Hannah had encouraged him to write letters, believing the connection important to his adjustment. "I'm not sure I know Mrs. Carter's recipe," Hannah admitted, "but I can try my own version." Inside the cottage, William immediately ran to check on the small garden box Hannah had helped him plant, radishes and carrots pushing their first green shoots through the soil. Thomas watched him with undisguised joy, as if still unable to believe his son was truly home. "He's settling well," Hannah observed, moving to prepare their meal. Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks to you. He's a remarkable child," Hannah replied, avoiding the gratitude in Thomas's voice. Since their return, he'd thanked her countless times for finding William, for making their home welcoming, for helping his son adjust to school. Each expression of gratitude added to the weight of uncertainty she carried about their future. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, William fell asleep on the small rug before the hearth, exhausted from the excitement of church and the constant attention of the townspeople. Thomas covered him with a light blanket, then joined Hannah at the kitchen table where she was preparing lessons for the coming week. "We need to talk," he said quietly, conscious of their sleeping child nearby. Hannah set down her pen, heart quickening. "Yes, I suppose we do. Our arrangement," Thomas began, choosing his words carefully. "It's served its purpose, hasn't it? You have your teaching position secured now. I have William back. The reasons we married no longer apply." Though she'd expected this conversation eventually, the words still stung. Hannah kept her expression neutral, years of practice hiding her emotions serving her well. "That's true," she agreed. "Our practical arrangement has fulfilled its objectives." Thomas studied her face, seeming to search for something beyond her composed exterior. "Yet things have changed between us, haven't they?" Hannah met his gaze directly. "How do you mean?" "You know how," Thomas replied softly. "These past months, caring for each other during my recovery, finding William together, building this home." He gestured around the cottage that had transformed from his grief-filled sanctuary to their shared space. "It's become more than an arrangement of convenience." Hannah's carefully maintained composure wavered. "Has it?" "You tell me," Thomas challenged gently. "When you sit reading to William in the evenings, when you mend my shirts without being asked, when you save the last piece of pie for me because you know it's my favorite. Are those the actions of a woman fulfilling a contract?" The directness of his question left Hannah momentarily speechless. For months, she'd hidden behind the safety of their arrangement, afraid to examine her growing feelings for both Thomas and William. "And you?" she countered finally. "Bringing wildflowers for my desk at school, walking me home each day, making that bookshelf for my teaching materials. Are those the actions of a man who married out of pity?" A smile touched the corner of Thomas's mouth. "You know they're not." From the hearth came the soft sound of William stirring in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible before settling again. Both adults glanced toward him, this child who had inexplicably brought them together and now bound them in ways neither had anticipated. "What are you suggesting?" Hannah asked, returning her attention to Thomas. "A new arrangement," he proposed. "Not one born of necessity or convenience or pity, but one built on what's grown between us these past months." Hannah's heart raced at his words, hope and fear mingling uncomfortably in her chest. "And what exactly has grown between us, Thomas?" Instead of answering directly, Thomas reached across the table, taking her hand in his calloused one. "When I thought I'd lost William, I stopped living, just existed, day to day, waiting for an end I was too cowardly to seek directly." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "You brought me back to life, Hannah. First with your quiet strength, then with hope when you found my son. Now with this home you've built for us." Tears threatened at the edges of Hannah's vision. "I came to Millfield with nothing but determination to find those missing children, to right a wrong I couldn't prevent." She turned her hand to grasp his more firmly. "I never expected to find a place where I belonged." "You belong here," Thomas said simply. "With us. With me." He hesitated, then added softly, "If you want to." The question hung between them, not a proposal this time, but something more profound. A choice to transform their marriage of convenience into something genuine, something chosen rather than necessitated by circumstance. "William needs stability," Hannah said, not quite answering directly. "He's lost so much already." "I'm not asking for William's sake," Thomas clarified gently. "Though he adores you, I'm asking for mine, for yours." Before Hannah could respond, William's voice came from the hearth, startling them both. "Are you and Hannah getting married again, Pa?" The boy had awakened unnoticed, and now sat rubbing sleep from his eyes, the blanket pooled around him. Thomas didn't release Hannah's hand as he turned to his son. "No, William. Hannah and I are already married. We're just deciding what kind of marriage we want to have. William considered this with a child's practical understanding. The kind where you sleep in the same room like the Carters? They said that's what married people do. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks at the innocent observation, while Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. Something like that, he managed. Would that bother you? William shook his head. Hannah already feels like family, he said matter-of-factly. She makes the bad dreams go away, like Ma used to. The simple declaration brought fresh tears to Hannah's eyes. While she'd been carefully maintaining appropriate distance, uncertain of her role, William had already accepted her as part of his reconstructed family. Thomas turned back to Hannah, a question in his eyes. What do you say, Hannah? Shall we make this marriage real? Not for convenience, not for William, but for us. Hannah looked from father to son, these two people who had unexpectedly become the center of her world. The practical arrangement she'd entered for security had evolved into something she hadn't dared hope for. A family, a home, a place to belong. Yes, she answered simply. A real marriage, a real family. Thomas's smile transformed his face, erasing the last shadows of grief that had haunted him since she'd first arrived at his door. He leaned across the table, pressing his lips gently to hers, their first true kiss, witnessed by a grinning 10-year-old boy who whooped with excitement. As autumn painted the hills around Millfield in shades of gold and crimson, Hannah stood in the schoolyard watching William play with the other children. His integration into the community had been smoother than she'd feared, his natural charm and intelligence winning over classmates and their parents alike. Thomas approached from the direction of the mine, earlier than usual. Since their decision to make their marriage real, he'd taken to walking her home from school each day, the three of them returning to the cottage together. You're early, Hannah observed as he reached her side. Special occasion, Thomas replied, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. William, time to go home. The boy came running, face flushed with play. Already? But Jimmy was going to show me his new marbles. Marbles will wait for tomorrow, Thomas assured him. We have something important at home. Hannah raised an eyebrow questioningly, but Thomas merely offered his arm, leading them through town with barely contained excitement. At the cottage door, Thomas stopped them. Close your eyes, both of you. William complied immediately, always game for surprises. Hannah hesitated, then did as asked, feeling Thomas guide them carefully inside. Now look, he instructed. Hannah opened her eyes to find the cottage transformed. A new bookcase filled one wall, its shelves lined with volumes she recognized from Mr. Porter's library. Books the Reverend had mentioned selling to fund church repairs. In the center of the room stood a small piano, worn but lovingly polished. Thomas, she breathed, moving toward the instrument in disbelief. How did you? Reverend Porter mentioned you played at your father's church, Thomas explained. Mrs. Mason was selling this one since her daughter married and moved away. William helped me bring it home yesterday while you were at your teacher's meeting. William bounced excitedly. Play something, Hannah. Pa says you know all the church songs and maybe even some dancing ones. Hannah sat carefully at the bench, running her fingers over the yellowed keys. Music had been her comfort during her father's illness, during the long, lonely years of searching. She hadn't touched a piano since coming to Millfield. The first notes were tentative, a simple hymn her father had loved. As the familiar melody filled the cottage, Hannah felt the last pieces of her guard falling away. This wasn't a woman offering a temporary arrangement. This wasn't a man accepting out of pity or loneliness. This was home. This was family. This was love, not discovered in a moment of passion, but built carefully day by day through small kindnesses, shared purposes, and chosen commitments. Thomas moved to stand behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as she played. William leaned against the piano, watching her fingers move across the keys with fascination. Our family has music again, Thomas said softly, his words meant only for her. Just as it should. Hannah looked up at him, seeing in his eyes not gratitude or pity, but something she'd stopped hoping for years ago. Belonging, acceptance, and love freely given rather than provisionally offered. Outside, Millfield's church bells rang the evening hour, their sound mingling with the piano notes. Hannah continued playing as Thomas began preparing their supper, as William sorted his prized collection of stones and feathers at her feet, as the autumn light faded into dusk. The marriage that had begun as an arrangement of pity and convenience had transformed into something neither could have imagined that December day when a desperate stranger arrived on a coal miner's doorstep. Through shared struggles and unexpected joy, through deception revealed and forgiveness granted, they had found what both had secretly longed for, not just survival, but a life worth living together.